Before we talk about this topic, I'd like to just share a definition of Hinduphobia because too often we face kind of a whitewashing or denial of Hinduphobia because people will make semantic arguments like no one fears Hindu Dharma or no one fears Hindus. A group of academics came together in 2021 at Rutgers University here in the United States and came up with a working definition. And I think that it's important that we share this definition so that we are having a conversation on the foundation of a shared starting point. So they defined Hinduphobia as a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Sanatan Dharma or the Hindu Dharma traditions and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. So when we're talking about anti-Hindu hatred or anti-Hindu bias, we are also talking about Hinduphobia. So is Hinduphobia on the rise globally? And I would say absolutely. It has been kind of a steady steam in many hotspots across the globe, but it's boiling over. We see that in two ways. First is Hinduphobia on the ground, and then Hinduphobia online, and both of those things are interrelated. On the ground, a good example is what we're seeing happening in Bangladesh today. We know that Hindus have faced the brunt of violence from the time of partition leading to the 1971 Bangladeshi Hindu genocide. Yes, political dissidents were targeted, independence leaders that were Muslim were targeted, but Bangladeshi Hindus bore the brunt of the violence and the atrocities that occurred in 1971. And throughout the years, no matter what the government, Hindus have bore the brunt, whether it's during elections, during other sorts of political unrest, Bangladeshi Hindus have been the target of violence, of land grabs, and of other atrocities. And we're seeing that today. Now, what happens is that not only are they facing this hatred, but a second layer of Hinduphobia is the denialism that comes with it. People don't want to acknowledge the fact that a genocide occurred in which Bengali Hindus were specifically targeted. People don't want to, even today, as we're seeing live footage, you'll see so-called fact checks where they'll cherry pick 2 or 3 examples of maybe footage that's being shared as if it's violence that's occurring today, but in actuality occurred maybe a few years ago, using those types of cherry-picked examples to somehow suggest that the targeted violence that's being faced by Hindus today is somehow lesser or not worthy of international outcry. So that is, I think, a very relevant example of Hinduphobia that's occurring right now. The other way that we see Hinduphobia occurring on the ground is through institutionalization of anti-Hindu bias. We've seen this a lot in the diaspora, whether we're talking about the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the United States. How do we see this? We see this through the demonization of Hindu communities as belonging to an oppressive and hateful religious tradition. So Hinduism is equated with caste oppression, with bigotry, as if we not only inherently as people are bigoted or oppressors, but that our religious tradition mandates that we oppress others based on their ancestral backgrounds. So we've seen legislation where caste is sought to be added as a protected category in places like the United Kingdom, in California here in the United States, and we're seeing moves like that, similar moves in both Canada and Australia. Now, the point is that Hindus are minorities in all of these diasporic countries. Second is that existing laws already cover protection against anyone who might be discriminating on the basis of an ancestral background, meaning where someone was born or what community they come from. So what the addition of caste does is that it specifically singles out people of Indian origin, and specifically Hindus, because one of the most prevalent and entrenched negative stereotypes about the Hindu Dharma traditions is that inherent to the teachings and the practices is this oppressive caste system. So that's another way in which we see that Hinduphobia is on the rise. Now, let me talk a little bit about online hatred. There have been reports that have shown a causal link between rhetoric that we see online that's anti-Hindu and then physical or that it manifesting as physical attacks. We see a lot of that as well. So there are studies by an institute called the Network Contagion Research Institute that have found these causal links, whether it's just kind of anti-nativists in the diaspora specifically that are perpetuating anti-Hindu slurs online, or whether it's South Asians themselves, people from the Indian subcontinent. You're talking about people who are sympathizers of separatist movements, whether it's rooted to separatism in Kashmir or the Khalistan movement. You see a lot of anti-Hindu rhetoric. So where we've seen a lot of online rhetoric, we are seeing manifestation of anti-Hindu attacks here on the ground, especially in the United States, in places like California, where there are kind of hotspots of Khalistani activism, especially in Canada and also in the UK. So, for instance, we've seen attacks against Hindu individuals. We have seen Hindu temples being targeted with vandalism in Canada. Even Hindu leadership, first it starts with targeted attacks on temples that might include, destruction of property or vandalism. But then we've also seen it escalate to attacks on the Hindu temple presidents or leadership in places like Vancouver. So these types of attacks are driven by Khalistani activists. Now, some may claim, and some try to whitewash these attacks as political, but why are they then attacking Hindu institutions or individuals who are Hindus? Why are they engaging in anti-Hindu rhetoric that specifically attacks Hindu individuals, attacks certain practices that might be commonplace among some Hindu communities, like vegetarianism, or uttering different types of slurs, and again, trying to equate caste oppression with the Hindu Dharma traditions. So that's another example of how we see online hatred manifesting in on-ground violence. Now, how or why is Hinduphobia on the rise? I think that it's multifactorial, and some of those factors are, one, those people who hold anti-Hindu animus or anti-Hindu hatred are far more organized. There's also some institutional capture that's involved, so that where there are incidents of anti-Hindu atrocities, their machinery that is well embedded in legacy media, as well as the human rights industry, as well as in Western governments, that they will diminish what is happening to Hindus. And very often what's happening to Hindus is occurring in countries where there is an official state religion, or where certain clerics and certain institutions are allowed to basically target Hindu minorities, especially in places like Pakistan or Bangladesh, without any sort of public censure or any sort of governmental or state punishment. The other issue is, so there's this organizational capture that occurs, so that it allows for the minimizing of what Hindus are facing. The other issue is that we don't know our own history. We also don't share our own history. What are the types of atrocities that we have faced historically, whether it was the destruction of our temples, whether it was taxes that our ancestors were forced to pay because they chose to hold on to their religious tradition. These are stories. This is a legacy that we don't document enough. We don't pass it on. And a key to ensuring that atrocities do not repeat in history is knowing history. And I think that we as a global Hindu community need to do far more in terms of it's not like these atrocities are not documented. It's creating or it's digging into where they have been documented and putting them into formats that are more readily accessible for us and our next generation. One of the things that I can just end with is just an example of atrocities that we know that there are survivors of those atrocities, whether it's partition, whether it's the ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Pandits or Kashmiri Hindus in Kashmir, whether it's atrocities or violence faced by both Hindu and Sikh communities during the peak of the Khalistan movement in Punjab, or what happened in 1971 to Bangladeshi Hindus. All of these things are well documented. There are people who have survived these atrocities. And very often what happens is that our own community and those survivors don't want to talk about it anymore. And yes, these are difficult topics to grapple with, but it's so important that we capture these stories before some of these victims age out and they pass on, and the stories will go with them. So it's really important that we really commit ourselves to documenting some of these oral histories so that we do not forget and that our children and grandchildren don't forget. Is Hinduphobia on the rise because of India's rise? And, is it spurred by some kind of jealousy or envy? I think that's probably a complicated answer. Certainly, we see that as India rises, as India asserts more independence in terms of what decisions it makes, especially in the foreign policy realm or even domestically, we do see a lot of inaccurate and negative coverage in legacy media like the New York Times or the BBC or the Washington Post. And that negative coverage very often can veer into Hinduphobia because the Bharatiya Janata Party is very often described as a Hindu nationalist party. So there is some relation there, but I would say that Hinduphobia has been kind of steady in some of the negative narratives that we see about Hinduism, conflating Hinduism with all sorts of negative and hurtful and horrific social practices. That's something that we've been dealing with for centuries. But I will say that the rise of Indians, and that is the rise of Indians world over, including the United States and Canada and the UK, that as a result of that, I do believe that we're seeing from nativist voices, kind of white nationalist voices, increasing rhetoric, expressing things that about Hinduism, and Indians being dirty and that sort of thing, but also that Indians are taking Westerners' jobs. So you see that level of rhetoric coming as a result of both the increase of the number of people of Indian origin in these diasporas, as well as their relative success. And we also see the rising Hinduphobia as a result of people not actually paying attention to it. So when you have a community that has seen successes, and that by no means is to suggest that there is not segments of the community that are not struggling, but when the overarching story is one of economic and educational success, when Hinduphobia arises, I think that that success ends up becoming a barrier to our ability to get other communities to speak out against or to condemn Hinduphobia. So that's one aspect of it. The other part of it is that people just don't know enough about the Hindu Dharma traditions to be able to recognize adequately when something is Hinduphobic. And that's certainly something that the Hindu American Foundation, the organization which I run, is working hard at, is to educate people about the Hindu Dharma traditions so that when people tweet or post something on social media or run something in the media that is negative or inaccurate or hateful, that more people are able to recognize it.